Okay, so the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the OCU, the so-called Ukrainian church, basically they've accepted the Filioque. They are basically saying the Filioque in the Creed, in the Nicene Creed. It's been published today all over the internet on different social media accounts, and basically, number eight, right there, the eighth sentence, it says the filioque right there. So that already just proves that the OCU is illegitimate. But what's going on here? It's a repeat of history. I, I already knew that the OCU was going into the papist direction. I just was not able to fully prove that. But here you go. The OCU is accepting the filioque into the creed, and so, yeah, you don't need any more evidence beyond that. That's that's the evidence. The OCU is basically committing a grave violation and should not be recognized by any jurisdiction. Um, so, this is just a repeat of history, and this happened a long time ago, back in the 1300s, 1400s. The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, they conquered Western Russia, uh, Lviv, Lvov, Kiev, and so that territory became a vassal state of the Polish government. The Russians living there were still Orthodox. They still considered themselves Russians. They were Russians, and they continued to communicate with Russia proper. They would do trade and travel, and they would still speak Russian. Yet they'll have somewhat of a different dialect, but they did not need translators when going into Russia proper to do some business, and mostly trading stuff, right? And so, and same thing with Russians coming into that territory controlled by the Poles. They did not need translators going in there as well because they spoke the same language. They were unified by the same religion, the same faith, the Orthodox Church. And so the Polish king eventually did not like this. 200 years later, they started to push this idea of a separate nation. They tried to create Ukrainianism, and also they want to force the people there, the Russian people living in these vassal lands of Poland, especially Kiev and Zaporozhia and Lvov. They wanted to force them to become Roman Catholics. And so instead of just executing people and force them to accept their faith, they decided to do some kind of compromise where you guys could still be Orthodox, but you just have to honor the Pope and commemorate the Pope, obviously, and creating unitism. And so the Brest Unia was signed, and of course, many Orthodox bishops in Kiev, they rejected this. They said, "No, we don't accept this Brest Unia," and so we condemn these heretics who joined the papists, basically. And so um, later on, there was a Zaporozhian rebellion. The Zaporozhian Cossacks rebelled, and for political reasons, of course, but they wrote letters to the Russian Tsar saying, "Hey, fellow Russian, we decided to rebel against the Poles, and we're tired of their persecution of the Orthodox faith. We're tired of their discrimination of treating their Russian subjects as vassals, right? And so we have this rebellion. Come help us out. Send in your troops, help us out, save us, right?" The Russian Tsar obviously sent troops. The Russian people were finally reunited again. And same thing happened in Belarus. The Belarusians also rebelled against the Poles, and like you had this huge Russian reunification going on. And when I say Russian, I'm not just talking about the Russian people. I'm talking about the Orthodox faith. The Orthodox faith basically is what kept these people together. And so, and back in those days, To be Russian was to be Orthodox for a lot of these people. A lot of the common people thought Orthodoxy and being Russian is one and the same. You cannot separate the two. And if you accept Islam or if you accept Papism, which they also call the Latin faith, if you accepted Islam or Papism, you are a traitor to both your Russian identity and simultaneously the Orthodox faith. You cannot separate those two. And of course, there are still some people who accepted this unia. They accepted the uniatism. They became what many people today would refer to as Eastern Rite Catholics. And there's a different sort of variation of Eastern Rite Catholics. I'm not going to go into full detail, but today in Ukraine, a lot of these Eastern Rite Catholics are called Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the UGCC, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. That's the UGCC. And those are basically the uniates, the schismatics who left the Orthodox Church, and they LARP as Orthodox, but they are part of the Pope. They're an extension of Rome, they're an extension of the Vatican. And back in those days, the Zaporozhian rebellion, the Cossacks rebelling against Poland, and the Russian people being reunited, kind of slowed things down for the Vatican and slowed things down for the Poles because the Poles lost territory. The old Russian borders were restored, and then a couple years later, Peter the Great gets on the throne and forms the Russian Empire. And then the Russian Empire grows and expands, and Poland itself gets absorbed into the Russian Empire. And then, of course, you have these angry Polish aristocrats who are not happy that they're under the Russian Empire. A lot of these Polish nobility, they start to promote separatism within Russia. And of course, where else would they promote this separatism? Oh, and in Western Russia, in around the Kiev area, around the Zaporozhye area, around Odessa, right? They would promote this separatism. They would start uh, promoting the idea of Ukrainianism, right? So that there's a correlation between uniatism and Ukrainianism because basically, if you're Ukrainian, you're also part of a different church, right? You're not necessarily part of the Russian Orthodox Church, right? You're part of a different identity, right? And so this idea was being pushed by Polish aristocrats, and and a lot of Polish nobility would even have their own underground printing presses, and they would try to force this idea of a separate language onto the common folks that lived in those regions. And of course, even the separatists did not have a unified idea. What is this language that we are creating, this Ukrainian language? Plus, they're creating a new language. They were creating a new language right there in the 19th century. And what's interesting is that in the 19th century, in 1839, Russia also restored a lot of schismatic parishes. Like they restored a lot of schismatic parishes. They accepted them back into the Orthodox faith. About 250 of them in 1839 have returned to the Orthodox faith. That also kind of slowed down a lot of this separatism from Russia. And so, but the Polish aristocracy didn't stop, of course, and they would continue promoting this separatism. And so these common folks and some of these intellectual liberals, they would promote this idea of Ukrainianism. They would promote this separation, but were not fully united. A lot of these separatists had disagreements. They were thinking we're creating a brand new language in order to separate, but like but they did not agree on how the language should sound. Should it be a little bit more closer to Russian? Should it be a little bit more closer to Polish, or maybe some Polish with Germanic, right? They did not have unity amongst themselves. So obviously, such projects were not taken seriously. The local authorities over there in that region, by the way, that region of Ukraine at the time was called Malorussia, Little Russia. Another part of it was called Novorossiya, Novorossiya meaning New Russia, and it extended from Kharkiv to Odessa. Right? And nobody there never considered themselves Ukrainian, right? And Malorussia, yeah, like there were some folks who might use the term Ukrainian, but Ukrainian in the sense that it was a regional, geographical location on the edge, as a borderland. What did it border? Oh, Poland, okay, right? And so in Malorussia, maybe there were some people who would have referred to themselves as oh, Ukrainцы or Ukrainцы because basically they're on the edge, right? And so that'll be the closest thing to someone remotely thinking they're Ukrainian, but they never thought of it as a separate nationality or a separate identity, right? They still knew they're Russians who spoke just a different Southern dialect. They had a Southern dialect. It was not a it was not like basically a proper Russian dialect that was spoken in St. Petersburg or Moscow, right? And so um, a lot of this separatism was, of course, quelled, and it was not taken seriously by local authorities, and unfortunately, it was not taken too seriously by the Russian authorities because eventually it was starting to spring up. Oops, something fell down. I apologize for that. But eventually, it will spring up again right before the First World War. The Austro-Hungarians would jump on board of this. They would jump on board of this Ukrainianization of separatism, and uh, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I believe, controlled a certain part of what is modern-day Ukraine. And if you heard of the Tellerdorf massacre, well, they massacred a bunch of Russians. They genocided the Russians who were subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The only Russians they left alone were the ones who they told, "Hey, you either stop admitting that you're Russian, and we won't genocide you, and you must accept that you're Ukrainian, and your family will live." Some of these people accepted the fact that they were Ukrainians, and some of them were rewarded with military ranks and and so on, right? And so then you have the First World War happen. Um, a lot of these so-called Ukrainians start moving in with the Austro-Hungarian army. Then, of course, the Russian Revolution happens, and there's a huge giant mess, and so actually, a lot of these Ukrainian military units they stay back. They don't retreat with the Austro-Hungarians and Germans. The Russian Civil War happens, and what's interesting is that the Soviets, the Reds, they promote this idea of Ukrainianism, and they kind of create their own atheistical version of the Uniats or of Uniatism, right? They create their own atheistical version of Ukrainianism, and so the people living in Malorussia and Novorossiya, they were forced to accept this Ukrainianism. Um, and there, a journalist in Odessa, he wrote an article in the 1920s, like around 1925. He's asking, wait a minute, why are we being forced to be called Ukrainians? Like Odessa is part of Novorossiya. Why can't we just have a Novorossian republic? Why can't what's going on here? Of course, he was censored, and that article was censored. And it's like, how dare you question this, right? And so the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was formed, and and of course, because there's a Ukrainian country now, well, like a Ukrainian Orthodox Church was formed as well, right? But under the Moscow Patriarchate, which of course this will definitely not create any confusion in the future, which it did, and so you have this Ukrainian Orthodox Church being formed, and then of course the Nazis during World War II they take over Ukraine, and they take advantage of this separatism, this Ukrainianism, and then of course the Soviets they recapture their territory, and the Soviets continue to fund Ukrainianism. They subsidize the Ukrainian language. They basically force the schools to teach the Ukrainian language. They um, basically force it upon universities. Um, my own grandma remembers how she was forced to become Ukrainian by the Soviet authorities, right? Uh, like because she knew she was Russian, and all of a sudden she was forced by the Soviet authorities to become Ukrainian. Well, things happen, and of course, by 1991, the Soviet Union falls apart. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, they separate from the USSR illegally. Of course, that's a topic for another day. But uh, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus built borders between themselves, between each other, and many Russian nationalists have predicted this will eventually create a war between Ukraine and Russia. Some thought it will happen immediately, some predicted it will happen sometime in the future. And of course, almost 30 years later, uh, you have this civil war in Ukraine in the southeast already being waged by separatists who want to leave Ukraine, and there's already problems being created for the UOC, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. They're having these problems because uh, many of the people in the Donbass region who are separating from Ukraine, they they're also part of the UOC, right? And so there's this issue right here. And of course, the government starts to be very suspicious of the UOC. They start to persecute the UOC for 8 years in a row. For 8 years in a row, the UOC is being persecuted. And of course, in the 90s, post-Soviet era, you have the OCU being popularized, and the OCU are a bunch of schismatics who left the UOC, and the OCU basically claimed, "Oh, we're the true Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We have the Kiev Patriarchate. The Kiev Patriarchate is true," which is definitely not true, but they keep pushing this Kiev Patriarchate idea. And recently, a couple of years ago, the EP and the Alexandrian Patriarchate, they recognized the OCU as legitimate, and so now there's confusion. Now there's like two Ukrainian Orthodox churches plus a Greek Catholic Ukrainian church, the UGCC. So you have the UGCC, the OCU, and the UOC. And the UOC is so far still the only legitimate Ukrainian Orthodox church that exists. And so, of course, the OCU is suspiciously promoted by a lot of Western powers, by Roman Catholics. And what's interesting, the EP supports the OCU. The EP recently has been known to just constantly hang out with Roman Catholics, be super nice with Roman Catholics, with the Pope, hanging out with the Pope a lot. And right now, with the Russian invasion, the government has totally continued to uh, has totally continued to persecute the OCU even more. Sorry, the UOC. They started to persecute the UOC a lot more while prompting up the OCU. And what's interesting is that the OCU is claiming that they're legitimate and they're truly Orthodox, and then now they're promoting the Filioque. So, like I've been talking to you guys for 18 minutes now, and so we're back to the Filioque. So, what's interesting is that history is being repeated again. The Polish government, through the Vatican, they attempted to create a uniate church. They somewhat succeeded. Like a certain portion fell away, created the UGCC, but that was not a total victory. Majority of people living in that region were still Orthodox. Now the OCU is formed, and the OCU claims to be Orthodox. They're not papists, apparently. But for some reason, the OCU is really friendly with the UGCC, while the UOC is not friendly with the UGCC, right? And then now in 2022, the Russian government officially invades Ukraine. And then you have this persecution of the UOC. The UOC, despite the fact that the UOC broke away from the Moscow Patriarchate, the UOC is still accused of being a so-called Moscow church. And and the OCU is now promoting the Filioque. So the OCU is they're seizing UOC parishes. And in Lvov, by the way, in the city of Lvov, they've already claimed that they got rid of all UOC parishes. The mayor, like I believe it was today, the mayor of Lvov has declared that there are no more UOC parishes. only OCU and UGCC and whatever other Protestant faiths are over there in that city. And so now that the OCU is becoming more powerful through the Ukrainian government, the OCU is now suspiciously pushing the Filioque in the creed. This is obvious. This is obviously I don't understand how could the EP even allow this, right? Or how could the Alexandrian Patriarchate like uh, like not notice this, right? Because I believe that the Alexandrian Patriarchate is on board with the EP, and I'm thinking, okay, the EP, fine, whatever. But the Alexandrian Patriarchate, are you not noticing this? Like, like this filioque? Isn't that supposed to be heresy, right? So, I've been rambling for about 21 minutes now, and I'm just pointing out that this is just a repeat of history, and um, the Vatican failed, and so they're attempting. They've always been attempting, but now that there's no more Russian Empire, there's no more Soviet Union, right? And now's the time. Now there's so-called democracy, right? And and plus now this war right now is like kind of giving them this advantage where they would like to take over all the UOC churches and replace them with OCU parishes. Well, uh, and then they'll promote the Filioque, and of course, they would they would promote Roman Catholicism, and they'll become Uniates. There have been other Ukrainian bloggers who are in hiding now. Many of them have escaped to Russia, but there were Ukrainian bloggers who have been saying there's a conspiracy out there to make Ukraine a Uniate country. Of course, a lot of common people, they've not been listening, and this is what they have now. What's interesting, though, speaking of history repeating itself, you have Zelensky attempted to create certain rules where apparently Polish politicians can be elected apparently by Ukrainian people, and like these Polish politicians can come to the Ukrainian Supreme Council and they could um, serve as elected politicians, which um, this has not been confirmed, but this was something that was apparently attempted in the summer, where Polish politicians were apparently considered like elected representatives in Ukraine, which seems like Poland itself, not just the Vatican, but it seems like Poland itself wants to restore the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia's constantly being accused of trying to restore the USSR. Baloney. But for some reason, nobody's noticing that Poland, with its democracy, apparently, like nobody's noticing that it might be trying to attempt to restore the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What like uh, that, of course, I can't really confirm that, but I've heard stuff like that apparently Zelensky has been working on a project like this to sell out Ukraine to Poland, but that's not been confirmed. That's all speculation at the moment. But what is confirmed is that that the OCU. It's been confirmed that the OCU is basically reciting the Filioque, and that's just not acceptable. And at this point, any Ukrainian soldier who is part of the UOC, like who's fighting for the Ukrainian government, what are they fighting for? In reality, they were not fighting for anything in the first place. Like they were brainwashed into believing that they were fighting for their country. They never were fighting for their territory. They never were fighting for the defense of their homeland. They've been forced to believe that. They've been brainwashed through years of history, through years of communist history, through Soviet history, telling them that, oh, you guys are Ukrainians, you guys are your own people. Well, these people separated, and now they think they are their own people, right? But now they're acting surprised that their own government is somehow persecuting their religion. Interesting, right? So. Yes. So like if this does not wake up the military of Ukraine, the religious faction of the Ukrainian military, I don't know what will, because it's like For 8 years, the Ukrainian government has been persecuting the UOC, and OCU has been taken over, forcing the UOC to get out of their own parishes for 8 years in a row prior to the Russian invasion. Prior to the Russian invasion, this has been happening. And recently, with the whole Kiev Lavra situation, that exploded, right? And for some reason, not many Ukrainian soldiers have spoken out. There were a few who did, but the vast majority are still silent. What are they fighting for at this moment? What are they defending? Their own faith is their faith is being attacked by their own government, who is sending them to die on the front lines for them. What are they fighting for? Okay, well, that's my rant. That was about 25 minutes, 51 seconds. And it's almost 1 o'clock here, so goodbye.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and go to patreon.com/altmonarchist if you really want to support the channel. God bless.